Let me say I'm truly honored to be with you today. I want to thank all of you for inviting me, and in particular, the Director General of the Manufacturers Association, Mr. Segun Ajayi-Kadir. You've asked me to speak on the role of trade in a post-pandemic recovery in Africa. Much of the continent's population today remains unvaccinated. Less than 5% of Africans are fully vaccinated compared to over 60% in developed countries. Unequal vaccine access and poor fiscal capacity has led to a K-shaped global economic recovery, with advanced and some emerging economies surging ahead because they have access to vaccines and they have very strong fiscal capacity, which they've used to revive their economies, and they've also had accommodative monetary policy. But those at the downward end of the K-shape, the regions of the world, Latin America, the Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa, lag behind because they don't have as much access to vaccines, and the fiscal stimulus, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, that they've been able to give has been much, much less due to limited fiscal space. So projected growth in Sub-Saharan Africa, 3.7% for 2021, according to the IMF's latest projections, lags behind the 5.9% global average. Debt dynamics on the continent are worsening, with debt ratios climbing from an average of 33.4% in 2015 to over 50% in 2021. In the absence of concerted international action on debt sustainability, this will weigh on future public investments in health, education, and infrastructure as more and more fiscal revenues go into debt service. The pattern for trade is also marked by divergence, with Africa recovering more slowly than other regions, just as we talked about for output. Africa's share of global trade dipped to 2.5% last year, and the trends are not favorable. Our economists project that between 2019 and the end of 2022, Asia's exports would have grown 18.8%, and North America and Europe's by around 8%, compared to 4.8% for South America, 2.9% for the Middle East, and 1.9% for Africa. So you can see that this pattern with regard to trade also mirrors the pattern almost completely for the growth of output. We need to reverse our presence on the downward part of this K-shaped recovery and use the recovery from the crisis to increase Africa's share of global trade. I'm not emphasizing trade just because I'm a DG of the World Trade Organization. The fact is that trade has a critical role to play in getting our economy and African economies in general onto a sustainable upward path. Trade is essential for ending the vaccine inequity I talked about, and trade can be the bridge in the K-shaped recovery, helping all economies converge upwards. Let me look at both of these in turn. Trade is essential to produce and distribute the COVID-19 vaccines we need. These vaccines rely on inputs from multiple countries, 19 countries for the Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna vaccines, and around 15 countries for AstraZeneca, to take two examples. And they must get into people's arms in every country in the world. That's why the WTO has been working hard with vaccine manufacturers and other stakeholders to help them identify supply chain bottlenecks that could deter investment in additional production. Our secretariat here continues to monitor export restrictions and trade facilitating measures. Together with my counterparts from the World Health Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, we are pushing to mobilize financing for vaccine production and working with COVAX and the African Vaccine Acquisition Trust to encourage those sharing delivery schedule swaps so that most of our countries can access the vaccines sooner. One focus of the WTO's vaccine work has been to encourage investment in increased production in Africa. The experience with the pandemic has made it painfully clear that it is not tenable for the continent to depend on imports for 99% of vaccines and 90% of its pharmaceuticals. Moreover, overly concentrated vaccine production, 80% of the production of exports is from 10 countries in Europe, North America, and Asia, which means a great deal of concentration. And we have seen that such concentrated production doesn't work. And that's why we spent a great deal of time at the WTO trying to work with manufacturers to encourage them to invest in emerging markets and developing countries, including on our own continent. Why am I talking about vaccines so much? Because I really feel and know all the evidence and data shows that it's a prerequisite for a return to the sustained growth and job creation. And as I've said, trade has a strong role to play in making this happen. But trade also has a wider role to play in the global economic recovery. Poor countries need access to bigger markets to grow rapidly. With trade projected to grow at 10.8% this year, more than twice as fast as GDP, external demand will far outpace domestic demand for many countries, especially those on the wrong end of the K-shaped recovery. For manufacturers, trade is also important, of course, on the import side, since it means better access to inputs as well as competitive logistics and other services critical to international competitiveness. I know that at the current moment, these inputs probably look less attractive because of difficulties with access to the dollar in the case of Nigeria and with the supply chain snafus that we see internationally. Nevertheless, we expect the current problems in the global supply chain, which are mostly the result of a mismatch between supply and demand, to be transitory. Markets will hopefully look more normal in a few months. In my remaining time, I want to focus on two issues at the heart of using trade to drive a stronger, more inclusive post-pandemic recovery in Nigeria and across Africa. The first is the importance of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, or MISMEs, as we call them in the trade lingo, and the importance of connecting MISMEs to regional and global value chains. The second is the need to take full advantage of current market dynamics, notably vis-a-vis commodity prices, and of the ambitious regional economic integration initiative that is the African Continental Free Trade Area. On micro, medium, and small enterprises, you're all familiar with the dynamism of African entrepreneurs, especially our Nigerian entrepreneurs. Indeed, many of you probably built up your enterprises from such beginnings. We need to do more to connect African MISMEs and to external demand so that they can sell more of their products, scale up, and become more productive. MISMEs matter because they employ the vast majority of the labor force, particularly women and young people, but they are underrepresented in cross-border trade. When they are able to tap into value chains, trade becomes more inclusive. Now, digital is very important here, especially for young Africans and the businesses they create. Many MISMEs have been able to weather the pandemic because they were able to access the internet and sell online. We should work harder, first to understand the barriers facing micro, medium, and small enterprises in global trade, and then to lower these barriers. At the WTO, different groups of members are seeking to do just that. One group is working on an e-commerce agreement. Another is working on empowering MISMEs, micro, medium, and small enterprises to trade. And a third is working on lowering barriers facing women in global economic trade. I'm proud to say that Nigeria is part of all of these new initiatives and negotiations that are ongoing here at the WTO, which we hope will ultimately make it easier for our micro, medium, and small enterprises and our women entrepreneurs to take advantage of national, regional, and global value chains. There is also an important role for supply-side work to help MISMEs upgrade the quality of their goods and services and break into these international value chains. Agencies affiliated with the WTO, the International Trade Center, which is an offspring of the WTO, the Enhanced Integrated Framework, another branch of the WTO, and the Standards and Trade Development Facility, yet another branch, are engaged in important work in this regard. This includes projects in Nigeria, as I was able to witness earlier this year with shea butter producers from Oyo State, who had sharply increased their earnings after obtaining international safety certification that opened the door for them to markets in the US, the UK, Europe, and the Middle East, and South Africa, many of which had been previously close to them. Turning to the recent uptick in energy and mineral prices, this will provide higher revenue for commodity exporters, though it will present challenges for other countries in Africa. We hope that these revenues will be used to tackle some of the logistical and infrastructural challenges which bedevil manufacturing on the continent and which have come sharply into relief during this pandemic crisis that we've had. But whilst the recent uptick in commodity prices presents revenue-enhancing opportunities for exporters, let me say that trade will be further enhanced on the continent if African commodity producers would work to add more value to their exports. This brings me to the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is a key locomotive for our economic future. When African countries trade with each other, the goods they exchange have more value added than the goods they send to the rest of the world. This is the good news. In 2014, according to the UN Economic Commission for Africa, manufactured goods made up 42% of intra-Africa exports, but less than 15% of the continent's external exports. So when we trade with each other, we tend to add more value to our goods. At the same time, however, Africa trades much less with itself than other regions. Intra-regional trade as a percentage of total trade is only 15% in Africa, compared to 60% in Asia, 60%, and 67% in Europe, just to give a few examples. So we need to reverse this. We need to trade more with each other, because if we can trade more with each other and increase that percentage, we can actually create more wealth and create more jobs, since we tend to send more value-added products to each other in the continent. The prospect of a unified market of 1.3 billion people offers enormous opportunities for Nigerian businesses that service now a home market of 211 million people. The large continental market makes investment more attractive in our countries. For sure, there are many hurdles to overcome. To use the AFCTFA adequately and properly. And I know that there was a lot of hesitation on the part of industry. I know that these hurdles on logistical, bureaucratic, and regulatory grounds to make capture of the large market that is within the continent a reality. But I'm confident that the right moment has come for regional trade to take place, and this will propel solutions to these logistical and infrastructural challenges that I set out. Just as I said earlier, knowing that the pandemic has exposed how dependent Africa is on other places for medical countermeasures like vaccines and therapeutics, and that in a crisis, this leaves us at the back of the queue. If we make full use of the African Continental Free Trade Area, we can build a pharmaceutical industry on the continent anchored in open regional and global supply chains for inputs. Nigeria is well placed to participate in this value chain for vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. Efforts are already underway with a lot of investments, $1 billion promised by Europe, similar amounts by the US to invest on the continent to get this industry open and to get the industry growing. And I hope that in Nigeria, we will also be able to take advantage of this, because I know that Rwanda, Senegal, Ghana, and South Africa are already on the list of countries that are receiving these investments. With the efforts of many of you, titans of industry in the country, we in Nigeria are adding value to some of our many products. We are building a continent-wide petrochemical industry. We are adding value to agricultural and mineral products. And in particular, we are trying to capture those markets closest to us in West Africa. I hope that this push will continue. As the world embarks in earnest upon a low-carbon economic transformation, the African Continental Free Trade Area presents a unique opportunity to build up our value chains in some areas that are vital for clean energy products, areas like lithium batteries. I hope again that on the continent we'll be able to take advantage of this transition to a low-carbon economy. To realize the full potential of the African Continental Free Trade Area, we must tackle the high costs associated with trade on the continent. According to the World Bank Trade Cost Database for 2019, trade costs for African countries are on average the equivalent of a 304% tariff, about double the level in high-income countries. These costs have a compounding effect and ultimately make it difficult to build African value chains. The WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement creates rules that should reduce trade costs by increasing transparency and simplifying rules. Many African countries have ratified this agreement and are implementing measures to improve cooperation between government agencies and support the automation and the digitization of trade transactions through electronic payments and single window systems. These reforms promise to cut costs for traders and favor the swift cross-border movement needed to build regional value chains. I should note that the WTO has established an office that helps members implement the agreement and connect to donor support where needed. The WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement Facility has already worked with 44 African countries and stands ready to provide further assistance. I just want to note, as we are talking about the issue of costs, yesterday I understand that the Central Bank of Nigeria introduced the e-Naira. It would be interesting to have your opinion, since this is a dialogue, on how you think this will work. The jury, of course, is still out, but I hope that with sufficient security, privacy protections, and maybe ease of use, this will have the potential to help lower some of the transaction costs that I talked about and foster greater financial inclusion, particularly for our women and unbanked citizens, as the central bank hopes. I hope that this will be a net addition to make trade easier and not more difficult. Before concluding, I had promised to challenge you, so here it is. Now, we were talking of taking advantage of the big market offered by the African Continental Free Trade Area. And I've given some examples of how we can do this. Our banks have already spread out across the continent, and there are many countries. And our fintech companies and other startups are doing the same. Our telecoms companies are trying. And of course, our entertainment and art industries are in demand across Africa and around the world. We also have other industries, our cement industry, and I mentioned earlier, perhaps our petrochemical industry, as we develop it, will also have a footprint across the continent. So my challenge to you is, in which areas can we do more? What are the opportunities that our manufacturing sector is missing? When I think of the comparative advantage we have, for instance, on textiles and fashion, The more I travel around the continent, the more I see that the demand for our African cloth and our fashions from Nigeria is huge. And yet I don't see us taking the manufacturing advantage to try and fill this gap. And I'm afraid that if we don't, some other country will from West Africa, because generally West African clothes and products are in demand. So this is a challenge to those of you in textiles. How can we take advantage of the huge market that is this provided through this African continental free trade area? I hope we will not miss the boat on this issue. This is something I raised when I was in government as Minister of Finance and said we should find a way to move from the little tailoring concerns that we have in the country and the tailors we send to each of our African countries and turn to this big potential area of manufacture, which I think we will see will give us an opening for consistent demand for these products on the continent. So here is one challenge that I throw to you to see how we can close this gap. A supportive, enabling environment at the international level is important for you to do this, but so is a supportive, enabling environment domestically. I hope that we can have that environment in our country as we try to solve the numerous problems before us. But I also hope that from the side of the WTO, we can help provide that environment internationally. And we stand ready to work with any of you on your bid to access regional and international markets. Thank you.